Predavanje nosi naziv, mislim mi smo ga nekako preveli kao, ne znam, nove prakse, novi koncepti, nove paradigme izdavaštva. Ono se dakle ne tiče nužno usko tipografije, nego zapravo i nekog šireg iskustva. Peter je specifičan po tome što, dakle, osim type dizajnom i grafičkim dizajnom i uređuje neke časopise i piše o dizajnu. Mislim, njegov spektar interesa je zapravo dosta širok i seže i u suvremeni ples, o čemu se možda kasnije biti neke riječi, ali da ne duljimo. I Peter, izvoli.
Hvala. I wish I could do it in Croatian, but it would be very baby language, so I'll have to do it in English. Although, as Nikola said, I come here all the time, but usually in the summer. So my vocabulary is limited to food and wine, but not so much about design discussion. It has been mentioned I work a lot with typography, and I won't talk about type at all today. So if people were interested in typography, and that's why you came, I have some specimens, but that's the only thing concerning typography. For the rest, I'll be talking about publishing, really, and about how design could be relevant for a larger group of people. I will be talking mainly about this project, but before I can speak about it, I think it's important to give it a context. And the context is that publishing today, if you follow publishing today, you mainly hear about stories of big magazines and newspapers shutting down. You rarely hear about successes. You mainly hear about things going wrong. You know, like a lot of magazines, favorite magazines, which I used to read, like they don't exist anymore. Holland, for example, country where I'm living, which is renowned for design, graphic design, typography, does not have any specialized design magazines. Can you believe it? Okay, it's and that's the the cradle. Like this is like place where you would expect the most to this to be happening, and it has to do with the changing times. And I want to make a case that the change which is happening has nothing to do with print versus digital, because a lot of people they try to simplify it, saying like there's a problem with print, and the print is dying, and the digital media is going up. I want to reassure you that this has nothing to do with this. So I'll make my story. If you look at the average kiosk, if you would go on the street and look at magazines, the magazines look differently. They look strangely uniform, strangely like there's always face on the cover, and there's always, if you start looking inside, 54% of pages on average of magazines contain advertising. So that means that, and mainly they're the same advertisers everywhere. So if half of the content of magazines is shared, which makes most magazines look alike, you'll find the same facial cream advertising in most female women magazines, and you find the same car advertising in men's magazines. And it's very hard to make the difference because they're all following the same business model, and the business model, come in. I'll move. And the business model is that it's the advertising-driven model of funding of publications. So, which seems to be new. I mean, it's new when you haven't really made much research. But if you look at historically at magazines and publications, the advertising-based model started in 1833, and this was like probably the first publication, which was a daily. From New York called New York Sun, which was revolutionary at the time because at that time in early 19th century, most of magazines and publishing was really direct. People would buy subscriptions from publishers, and it would be one-on-one connection between publishing and readers. This has changed when New York Sun came, and there was a guy called the founder of it, who would reduce the price of publication 10 times, but increase the print run 20 times. And it turned out to be a very profitable business. So the advertising would make a difference. It would fill the pages, and they would manage to engage much bigger masses. And this model has been copied wildly. Like I think 10 years afterwards, most magazines did the same. And surprisingly, since 1830s, there's been very little progress in publishing. So most magazines automatically adopt the same model in publishing, which is model rooted in early 19th century and used over and over and over until it became really exhausted. So today, a lot of magazines, they shut down because they keep repeating the same model rather than looking at new solutions for publishing. So for example, like a lot of magazines shut down not because they lose readers, but because they lose advertisers, which is a troubling fact. Imagine that what readers pay for the publications is not really what magazines cost, because all the income of most of magazines, if you look at this, almost 100% of income of these magazines is advertising and not what you would pay for it. So if you go and buy, I don't know, any of these magazines, doesn't really matter which one, and you pay 4 or 5 euros or dollars or kunas for it, that money does not go back to publisher. That money just covers the cost of selling the magazine, and the publisher's making money with something else. And what is troubling about this is that first, it becomes very confusing whose interest publications represent. If all the incomes comes from advertising and not from the readers, then it's a legitimate question to ask, like, who is it made for? Who is it, to whose interest the magazine is representing? And it's, of course, it affects also editorial decisions that magazines do, because all the income comes from advertising and not the readers. So the readers are basically products of magazine, not really the target group. If you buy these magazines, you're being put into the category of a target audience, and you represent a certain number, and that number is being sold to the advertiser. And the higher the number, the more you can ask for it, the more money you can ask for it. These magazines don't represent any physical value. When they're unsold, these magazines, they're destroyed, because again, it doesn't really, for the publisher, it's just a number which needs to distribute. They could give them away for free, because the sale does not bring them any money. The only reason why there's a price tag is to filter the right target group by asking you to pay a few euros. They guaranteeing that you get it to the right audience. When we started this magazine, we wanted to do one thing, and it sounds really simple. We wanted a magazine for the readers, and it sounds like a trivial thing, but in comparison to this, it's a radical step, because you're trying to make it that the readers become integral part of the magazine, and they are the primary reasons why the magazine is happening. That means also that all the money that comes to the magazine comes from the readers. We have some advertising, and we have 5% of the content, usually less than, it's usually 3%, is the advertising. So this is the magazine that we do. It's called Works at Work. Works at Work, it's a strange magazine, and when I'm in a design context, I'm usually very careful to avoid using term design. So I would not call it design magazine, because people get the wrong idea when you call something design magazine. When you call something design magazine, you expect that it's dealing with the surface of things. Design in traditional design media deals with appearance of objects and it forgets that design is something fundamental that makes something, allows to function some certain things. And what we do is that we don't separate in who makes things. Traditionally, design magazine, there's this clear separation between I don't know, if you look at shoes, like what are design shoes and what are not design shoes? What are design chairs, what are non-design chairs? What are design objects and non-design objects? And the differentiation is usually the education of the person and the price and context where it's sold. We don't do that, because you realize like a lot of the things that we cover in this magazine are made by people who don't call themselves designers. And I'll give you many examples. If you do that, suddenly you break this barrier, you break this bubble which is created around design, and you start looking at, design is something that has a potential to improve people's lives. I'll explain. We do some advertising, you'll see later, but the advertising which we do in the magazine comes from the readers themselves. Like it's because we created, it's made for the readers. The readers themselves do creative acts, and they're presented there, and you'll be able to see. Let me get straight to the content of the magazine. So we have small stories. I mean, small examples of stuff that presents this idea of unexpected creativity, creativity which is made by almost everyone, and often stimulated by environment. Usually, the less resources you have, the more creative and innovative you have to be, because you have to compensate for the lack of resources. So we often look at the places which are outside of the normal radar of design publications, often like difficult places. This particular issue was made in the Arctic. And we look like how people have to adjust to the life in the Arctic to make their lives more bearable. For example, to save the reindeers, they spray their antlers so they don't get hit by cars on the roads. In valleys in Norway, when you have no sun, you have to put these gigantic mirrors so they get at least some sunshine. How to beer drink outside in Norway when it's minus 20 degrees. You have the special beer gloves. All these small things that that people make their life again easier. Besides the short stories, we make also kind of the bigger stories, and I'll show some of them, and how some of them become inspirational for the magazine itself. This is a story from the first issue of Works at Work, and this picture is taken in Mumbai. Mumbai is the largest city in India, a place of 16 million people. So it's imagine Croatia and then multiply it a few times, being in one city. And Indian men, when they go to work in the city of Mumbai, they like to eat their homemade food, except that if you live in a city like this, commuting to your home to eat food, it's really not practical. It's impossible. You spend 2 hours crossing the city. So there's a question of how do you bring your homemade food from home to work on time. And there's a service which exists for a long time, for over 100 years. There's a service of people who don't cook. It's not a catering service, but who go to your houses and bring the food which is cooked by your mother or your wife, collect it in this container and bring it to the husband. And it sounds really easy, except it's made on a really large scale. Hundreds of thousands of people do it every day. In a city like this, and to bring one package from one place to another place, there will be up to 16 people involved in delivery. It passes from hand to hand. And you would imagine, these people are mainly illiterate. They cannot read, or they cannot write. They don't use any GPS devices. They don't use computers. Yet, somehow, they always find a way from point A to B. And in fact, they do it such efficiently that only 1 out of 6 packages 1 out of 6 million packages gets lost. It's a fact that cannot be replicated by any UPS or FedEx or Croatian Post or anyone, which is staggering fact. You go like, how on earth this is possible? So this would be kind of the example of the fact that we would go there to study what can we learn from this? What can we learn from such an efficient logistical operation, which works much better than anything else, because it's so low tech. These people operate very locally. They operate in a really small area, and then they shift the package to someone else who knows their area really well. So we would send a photographer and a writer and talk about this. That's not something you would find in a normal design magazine, because it's not dealing with surface of things. It's talking about functionality. It's talking about operation. It's about logistics, about management, about. And I think on a larger scale, you can learn a great deal from this. I'll be talking later about distribution of the magazine and how this example is really inspiring for the magazine. This example, I'm trying to mix it up to show that it's not always developing world, but it doesn't really matter where the story is coming from. This story, it's come from the Netherlands. Netherlands, it's a quite developed country. It's a story about traffic signs, and traditionally there's a belief that you improve road safety by putting up more traffic signs, and every time you have accident, you solve it by separating pedestrians from drivers and cyclists, and putting more traffic signs which indicate what should or should not be happening. At one point, when you have too many traffic signs, things stop working. And it doesn't matter if you put more and more, it just does not work. So the new trend that started in the Netherlands was removing traffic signs completely. And by doing so, you create a situation which looks dangerous at first because you remove the boundaries between pedestrians and cyclists and cars completely. You don't tell them what to do, and you leave it up to them to figure out, which sounds scary. But in practice, it means that if you look at before and after situation, the road safety becomes so much better because people actually pay attention. Right? They're not being told to do what to do. If you treat people like idiots, they will behave like idiots. You know, if you kind of take them seriously, they actually have to pay attention to what's happening. So a typical example would be like this, you know, no traffic lights, no separation, no indications of priorities, just leave them like it is. And surprisingly, no accidents happen because people naturally have to slow down, not by telling them to go 40, 50 kilometers per hour, but people really have to realize they don't have any other option. And this trend has been copied to other countries. You know, it's called the shared space movement, where the space is shared. There's no curbs, there's no separations of of any kind, yet it works. So it's removing of design actually is act of design. You know, by not doing something, you're doing more than you would have done by adding things. And that's not something you can consider because you always think that the design means adding to existing situation, and sometimes subtraction is an act of design as well. I took this because obviously it's geographically closer. Often what we do in magazine is we present stories which are well known, but we try to find an alternative angle to the same story that you know. And people know, of course, about Sarajevo and about the bad things that happened. It was a tragedy, the war, crazy, a lot of people died. And in media, it's mainly the story of tragedy and like a humanitarian crisis. And it's true, except that there's always an angle that it's ignored because mass media does not, they're always choosing very dramatic, information, and usually through disasters and through negative news. I think Works at Work is essentially a very positive magazine, and we're trying to see like how even in this difficult situation, people have this inherent ability to survive. So what we did, we sent the writer to Sarajevo because we heard about this. That the first thing I heard about Sarajevo siege was that someone told me that how many theater plays were played during the siege. The siege lasted 4.5 years. As you know, during the siege, there was no supply of water, electricity, gas, completely isolated. And you think like that in this situation, you would not expect that there would be theater plays. And people told me like there are concerts, there are exhibitions. Life was going on as normal because, again, people have this survival instinct to go on. And then a curious thing happened also is that all these people are locked in their houses and they have no place to go. And this particular situation of where you have surplus of time, you have all the time in the world because there's nothing else to do and it's dangerous to leave out. And lack of resources leads to a lot of possible inspiration. So where you have time and lack of resources, it forces you to look at all the existing things that you may have. So we documented, we looked at all the stories of these objects, which again, they're not design objects, but they are designed to, these are all the improvised heaters, which basically they were born out of necessity because there will be no gas. The only kind of source of warmth would be using solid wood or parquet or anything that was around. You creating all these kind of crazy objects that they didn't exist, and it's solving one particular thing, how to look safely out the window, how to bring fresh water when there's no water supply, how to make lights when there's no electricity. Every object comes with a story and its creators, and often it's made by people who'd never considered making these things. They're not beautiful objects, but they come up with this engaging storytelling which waits to be told, And somehow these stories are not very well known because you only know about the destruction from these places and nothing else. So people would make all kind of ways, improvised weapons. And we would document it, and this would be a story in the magazine. Stories come from all kind of parts of the world, and often there's this kind of delightful surprise. I think most of the cases, there is something that, again, you know, but also don't know about it. In this case, in this story, we look at the oldest company in the world. The oldest company in the world, and I often ask people, what do you think they do? Is a Japanese company called Kongo Gumi. And Kongo Gumi is a construction company, family-run, family-owned for 1,400 years. 86 generations of families, continuously doing what their grandparents and ancestors were doing. They are in construction business. They're building temples. So this is a wooden temple which they built. I don't know if I don't have more pictures. And if you imagine that they're doing this possibly for eternity, you would imagine that they would choose the most permanent, most durable material that there is. And in fact, they're using a not very permanent material. They use wood to build these wood temples. They don't use screws. They don't use nails. So these temples are made to last eternity by choosing materials which decay, and they changed every wooden beam, every wooden part is changed every 100 years. So this building could be 1,000 years old, but no part of it would be older than 100 years old because they keep changing parts. It's a bit like a self-regenerating skin. Yourself, there's no part of yourself which is older than a few years. 6 years, I think it is. Yet, your total self is older than the age of the parts. And it's, I think, a wonderful example of, again, planning for a longer time. Oh. Hello. And what we can learn from this, especially in a time when we cannot plan for 5 years. It seems to be impossible to plan for longer than 5 years. And suddenly you have a company which exists for 1,400 years without interruption, and how they kept, addressing the changes in society when the company is older than most countries around the world. It's kind of insane and inspiring story about management and long-term planning. We look at the, often situations where you would not expect things to be happening. So we look what prisoners do to make their life more bearable. This story was made in collaboration with the prisons and what objects they confiscate from prisoners. And again, you find fascinating examples of unexpected creativity. This is the latest issue which came just last week, very new. And a key story is this. I think I have this picture in detail. It's a story about, I guess, theatrical effects, or I don't know. So what you see here is completely it's a piece of theater, except that the audience is were the Nazis, and this is there was this special division of the U.S. Army called the Ghost Army, which consisted of inflatable rubber tanks and inflatable army. So all these tanks, what you see, were all they were all fake. They're all not real. It was a huge division, which consisted of mainly designers and artists. The artists were basically designers and artists which came from New York schools of art and design, from Parsons schools, from schools in Philadelphia. There are a lot of famous artists there. Ellsworth Kelly, the abstract painter, like a minimalist painter, would be part of them. A lot of other people that you may recognize were part of them. They were recruited to create this story of to pretend to be a division which never existed. They did a really good job, so they would create these artificial tracks, so from the military planes it looked like a real thing, so they would have to pay, it would be a lot about attention to details to create something to audience which was very, very carefully observing yourself. What these were, like a state-of-the-art amplifiers, where there were a lot of musicians which recorded sounds of tanks, and they would play them around like 24 hours, really so you could hear them almost 20 kilometers further away. They have these turntables and playing these sounds of around army going around. They're trying to pretend that they're much bigger than they are, and by doing so, they will be protecting cities from possible invasion. And there are estimations that this army of 1,000 units strong saved tens of thousands of lives by pretending to be bigger and by protecting certain areas. It's a story which is not very well known because it had been classified for most of the time. It was only declassified about 10 years ago. And we worked with a historian who looked at these declassified information. It still comes with these secret stamps. And about the kind of the road theater. This will be going, which was it's about how art and design can make a real impact on life of man. This particular issue is again, this magazine is doing a lot about. Most of the magazines, they're interested in latest information, and they're trying to be the first one to report on it. This magazine, we always made ourselves a motto of, relevance is more important than recentness. So it's not about just being the latest things, but I think it's really about, because we look at impact of design, that impact of design can be only measured where you have actually see the effects of it over time. So if you're being the first one to report on it, you have no way to measure possible impact. You can only do it when you can actually see if design makes a difference to people's lives. And I think our editorial policy is really looking at this. What kind of difference these objects, stories, inventions make to humans around the world. So this particular issue is about forgotten ideas, about things were used but completely fell out of use or forgotten. And there are many other stories. I mean, I could spend the whole evening telling you about probably the only designer who was nominated for the Nobel Peace Award and why it was forgotten and never implemented, about earliest examples of social design from the 1920s, stories about world passports, like a utopian idea of removing borders, a lot of all things that they're completely unknown by now. But I'll also address some practical things. My background is graphic design. You would imagine that it is my job to design such magazine. I'm not designing the magazine. The magazine is designed by these two people, Susanna Carvalho and Kai Bernau, who are wonderful book designers. And they design the magazine. They make sure that it's really readable. At the same time, people ask me why I'm not designing it myself. I think I am designing in some way by creating conditions of magazine to happen, but I'm not doing the layout of it as you imagine. And the conditions which I'm trying to suggest is this: that by making any new publications, it's not only about stories, and it's not only about the layout or photography or the typography. Most of a success of magazines is determined by where it gets to, or what kind of impact it can make, and that is mainly to do with distribution of magazines. And no, I don't. I used to do a different magazine before, some decade ago. I started a magazine called ... and I learned the hard way. I was just talking to Hervoy about this. That when we started ... we assumed that our job is to make a magazine and someone else's job is to distribute it for us, which sounds logical, except that we also learned that when we hired a distributor called Princeton Architectural Press, they would consume 82 to 85% of cover price. So you're left with very little margin to operate. They would change the cover. They would change the price of magazines, and and when they didn't sell the magazine, they would destroy it. They would not even return it to us, and there was nothing we could do about this. This is how distribution works until now. They put it to the stores, and they only pay you very small margin only for the copies which they sell. If they are unsold, they've been destroyed. They tear the. Sometimes they return you at least the covers, so you see they were destroyed. Sometimes not even that. They just report the numbers. When we started this, it was clear we have to change also the distribution. And I don't know if we have a sound.
Works
Yeah,
that
there you go.
BILAK wants to examine often ignored areas of design. In the spirit of this aim, we also intend to bypass traditional distribution networks, which typically take the largest part of the cover price, as well as control where the publication will be sold and at what price. Instead, we would like to deepen our relationships with our readers and make them partners in this enterprise. We call this social distribution. Let's see how it works. A reader based, for example, in Buenos Aires knows a lovely bookstore in his town that could be a good place to sell a magazine. He first contacts the bookstore, and if they're interested, he then contacts us. The next time he or one of his friends travels to one of our magazine hubs, he buys copies of the magazine at a 50% discount. He in turn sells the magazines to the bookstore at 60 to 75% of the cover price. So the reader's profit is 10 to 25% of the cover price. He sends information about the store to us, and we publish it on our website, driving other potential readers to the store. This distribution process supports local bookstores, involves readers as partners and agents of the magazine, ensures that all the parties get paid, and frees us up to focus on what we do best, publishing the magazine.
This was a thing that we proposed right when we started. We started magazine back in 2013, so it's almost 3 years now. We published 2 issues a year, so we're at number 6 right now. And it was a risky proposal. You know, we asked readers basically to do the job of the distributor, and we were not sure, like how it will work, if it will work. And we were delighted to see that it worked originally fairly well. You know, we got it to a number of stores. I mean, there's maybe about 80 places which stock the magazines. At the same time, we also saw the potential limitations. You know, it didn't work everywhere. You know, it worked really well in places where distribution didn't have really reach. You know, like in places like in Asia, in India, in South America, it worked really well. In Western Europe, it worked less well. You know, because the links between shops and distributors are really strong, and often they have they do have exclusive contracts that they could not take books from somewhere else. So we observed this happening, and at one point we decided if the idea is to reduce the middle chain of the middleman in distribution and to make it as direct as possible between reader and publisher, maybe you don't even need a store. You know, maybe just really need to work with the readers, and that's what we did. You know, we decided to find improvised way of getting magazines to the right places, which are often outside of stores. It would be communities, schools, groups of people, finding out completely different ways for selling the magazines. So this is, I made it just recently, how magazines, where it gets. You know, we have these packages of magazines, and people travel with those, and bring it to places that you would not normally again expect. I mean, I was just writing for a blog about how we brought the magazines to Iran. Even with places of international sanctions, or places whatever you imagine, from Chile to places in Africa. To make this happen, we realized one of the biggest part of magazine price is shipping. To address this, we have this traveling database on our website where people report their trips where they travel naturally. So I came to Zagreb yesterday, and I travel quite light, so I had potentially I could take magazines with me, so we asked readers to say where they travel, how much space they have available in their suitcase, and by doing so, we can make the magazine. We can connect these trips and bring it to places, and people can benefit by not paying the shipping price for it, and makes it again more accessible and more easy to obtain in places. I have to say so our income is partly from this. Of course, we sell it online. I mean, the online sales are probably the most important in terms of revenue, because in that case we get the 100% of the price. It's key. Subscription and direct sales are really important. But this became a really a cool way to create this community feeling, because people feel, we're being radically transparent about our operations. We publish how much everything costs, how much shipping costs, and how much printing costs. We print locally, we produce everything locally, and I think again, if you take readers seriously, there is something that they're willing to be engaged in this community. I think this may be my last slide. Yes, it is. But if there are questions, I'm more than happy to answer them while we're here, before you suffocate and wait. I brought some magazines, and they're in the back if you want to see them, because I think the best thing is to really see the physical thing. They are quite small, and I think people are usually surprised by the size. Like it's this size, 100 pages, but again, packed by things that we believe that there are no fillers. They are really stories to be told.